Hey friends, welcome to BEARTH Podcast. I'm Ash. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to introduce you to Steve Wiens today. He is a pastor in Minnesota and he wrote a book called Shining Like the Sun, where he collects 7 mindful practices and unpacks them based off things he's learned in Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism. It's a fantastic conversation, but you see, we go deeper than that. His church has been part of a process in the past year around what's being called inclusion. Now, in the progressive church, for those who may not know, and for those who are not a participant in churches, this is another word that is being used for truth and reconciliation around LGBTQ. For some who may say it's too little too late, I hear you. But you see, this is important. This is vital conversation. Truth and reconciliation is deeply painful because it means disrupting sociological systems, patriarchal systems of belief, of rules and regulations, of laws that have been unjust to millions of people. And so it's a step in the right direction. But we go deeper than that. We had such an incredible conversation that I've split it up into 2 parts for you. So I encourage you, no matter where you come from, to listen in and to hear what Steve has to say and to hear our conversation around these ideas. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. For now, listen in. Do you think that there's a point right now where sort of this, I'm going to just call it a grassroots movement for lack of a better phrase, is sort of bursting at the seams and finally being heard as far as the shift in how maybe faith ought to be applied in a kinder way?
I think so. And, I think there's a lot of different factors that maybe are giving rise to that movement. Certainly some of the most obvious ones, I think, are, with the the blooming of the internet and the ability to see and read everybody's reactions to everything on social media. And I don't always think, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's not a good thing nor a bad thing. It just is. We are reading now a truly global view of reality through so many different lenses. And so I think those of us maybe in the West who are saying, maybe who had a kernel of doubt about the institutionalized religion that we grew up with, but didn't really have anywhere to really take that. There was a few voices maybe 15 years ago that were starting to talk about a different way of thinking. But now that we can just see and read truly global perspective, we can see how small, and not even necessarily like wrong, but just how small and contextualized what we grew up with was. And so I think this grassroots movement is in part just getting really honest about the boxes that we built were just boxes and they need to be destroyed, and we can build bigger ones, to house God, and then they'll need to be destroyed too. Christians in the West are different than Christians in the East. I agree with that 100%. And I would also say, it's never before been so true that Christians, even in the US, are different than Christians in the US. There are just there's such a huge, that I don't even know what we mean when we say Christian anymore.
Has there been an area maybe in your community, maybe in your faith community, for which you've seen massive changes even in just in the past year?
Well, yeah, particularly in my church that I lead. So I started a church about 6 years ago. And so over the last year, there's been this little group of people, that probably 8 people, that was sort of tasked to listen to our congregation around inclusion. And it was made up of people of varying viewpoints on the issue. And what was so fascinating, we just reflected on learnings, and almost everyone said, this committee was so important for me to be on because I realized that I was holding on to being right more than I was holding on to something bigger and something more unitive. And so, I don't even know, there are certain people that haven't necessarily changed their own minds on what they personally think about inclusion, but they have seen that our congregation needs to move toward that, so we can keep expanding the conversation. That being truly a third way community means that there has to be room for all. And that was transformative. I mean, because you can just say, well, one person or a group of people can make a decision for a congregation, and that has its own effects. But when you allow conversation and the slow work of trust and change to do its work among real people in real time, it's fascinating what we've seen. It's fascinating the unity that brings versus just ending up in fighting and clustering around the poles of your own conviction. We've really found a third space, and so that's been beautiful. I mean, it's been beautiful to see.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
so important to have that space, because I think what happens is, and you see it everywhere, is the human condition immediately goes to its extremities of what it thinks it knows or interprets or it's been trained to believe or whatever the case may be. And so what happens is, and that this is the right or the left, and at the end of the day, the way forward is always to find those spaces where you find common ground first, and then you begin to mold and shape for the betterment of the whole.
there's this psychologist that I have loved over the last few years, Robert Keegan. And he has this quote. He says, "The great moment of liberation and embarrassment is when we realize that what we've taken as reality is just a construct of reality." Right. And so I think that's what you're saying. It's like when you can realize, oh, wait a minute, the thing that I took as pure gold truth, whether it's politically, theologically, whatever, is really just a construct. Then we can move toward more common ground, because like when you realize I've been living in a snow globe and not knowing it, but then when you can get outside of that snow globe and look at it and go, oh my gosh, those trees are fake, and there's something bigger. And we need to see that our viewpoints are, by their very nature, because it's my view, it's limited. And so moving to the Middle East, as you have it, when you get to see different points of view, if your perspective doesn't change and expand, then you're probably not paying attention.
Well, you also begin to realize too, I think, that people's belief systems, especially if they're based off maybe a family, a tribe, a church, a faith, whatever it is often a belief system, especially if it's a belief system that maybe harms other people. So exclusion can be very harmful. The idea of that is based on a system of control. And I'm deeply of the belief that every human being on the face of planet Earth, 7.7 billion people, everyone wants control of their narrative. Everyone's so afraid to not have control. No one can relinquish to the mystery of what is. And therefore what happens is, within that system of control, they create, as Brene Brown would say, the story I tell myself is.
Yeah.
Right. And so we tell ourselves these stories, and then we get other people to accept those stories, and then the tribe, and then the nation, and then, swaths of people accept this story. And then it becomes maybe a doctrine, a theology, a philosophy, a political statement, whatever. But it's actually a system that we have used, a tool we've used to control something we were afraid of or something that we didn't know. And the point is to sort of relinquish to the mystery of what we don't know in order to be inclusive.
Yeah. And those systems, you described it so well, those systems, and this is sociologically, written about, but they have to create scapegoats in order to prop their own control up. So inevitably those closed systems will cluster around those beliefs, which are all the same. And then if someone has a slightly different version of it, or a big time different version of it, they'll be scapegoated. And that system, those people need to scapegoat in order to survive. It's so fascinating. We can't get too haughty about that, because we all have been a part of those, and we naturally create them for our own survival, because we're so afraid of being alone. I think.
Well, and I start to, I've been examining this idea of justice a bit, because I kind of feel justice is the space that sort of my heart moves into understanding. And it's more than just a court system. right?
Yeah.
The way we often understand justice is punishment and reward system. You do this bad thing, you go to jail. You do this bad thing, you have a consequence. Da, da, da. And so we apply it in such a way that it's almost manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
Do good, you get this. Do bad, you get this. Rather than a word of integration that offers inclusion, that offers confronting harmful actions and behaviors, even if your belief system is something that is all you know. What are the actions doing? And then justice kind of addresses that part of it,
Yeah.
so that there can be, I think my favorite quote that I continually have gone back to, I think probably in the past 2 or 3 months, is Cornel West: justice is what love looks like in public.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a word of integration. It's a word of inclusivity. It's a word that has several steps underneath it that are grief and confrontation and love and healing, that
Mm-hmm.
ultimately reshape to the betterment of the whole.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, for the betterment of the whole, those with justice looks like love when those with power release power for the
Mm,
betterment of the whole.
mm,
And maybe we are afraid to do that because of what we'll lose. But if we don't do that, we actually remain imprisoned, because justice looks like love. I agree with Cornel West. Even those with power don't realize how imprisoned they are as well
yes.
by participating in propping up injustice. We're afraid to give up control, but the bitch of it is that unless we give it up, which was what love does.
We're talking about sort of coming back to this oneness, and it brings me to your book. Shining Like the Sun is the name of the book. First and foremost, just tell me about it.
The book took many different forms actually over the last few years. At first, I wanted to be this angsty treatise about how Christianity is changing and everything, our view on everything is changing. But the tone of that proposal was very, I don't know, it was way too angsty. And I think when I'm at my best, my voice as a writer is pastoral and hopeful. So I had to find my way to writing a book that expressed what I hoped we are moving into without all the angsty deconstruction. I wanted it to be a book about what I've learned about from Judaism, Buddhism, and Christianity, actually. So, 7 mindful practices: ordinariness, attentiveness, simplicity, rhythm, conversation, delight, and restoration. Those are the 7 practices. And mindfulness is simply learning to return to where you are, whatever you're doing, and also learning to return to who you are. And so the big thing about mindfulness, as I'm learning, is it's paradoxical, because when the moment you feel like you're failing at it is actually when you're succeeding. Like, you're sitting in meditation and you set your timer for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Holy shit, that's going to be so long. And then before you know it, your mind is off to the races and you're thinking about the meeting that's coming up at 9:00. And then you go, I'm not mindful. I'm not. But actually, that is when you're being mindful, right? That moment that you feel like you're failing at meditating is what will train you to return to the moment in the rest of your life. And so, um, the book is really about finding yourself, finding God, and finding the rest of humanity right here and now in the gift of this moment, whether it's a beautiful moment, sunset, or a really terribly painful one where you lose someone you love. Where can the divine be found? Where can I be found? And where can the rest of humanity be found? And it's really none other than right here and right now.
I love that. You open your book a little bit talking about a story about God creating humans and his frustration, and then it's being suggested to him that he hide on Mount Everest.
Yeah.
And he says, "No," God said, "humans are resourceful. Eventually they'll find me there." After a very long silence, one elder whispered something in God's ear. "That's it," God shouted, smiling. "I'll hide inside each human. They'll never find me there." And it was sort of this beautiful moment of, I had to pause because I thought, oh yeah, no, that is the last place that we look. We look so existentially for our freedom, for ourself, for God, for divine, for the answer, for the ticket out of the thing that we are in, of the body that we are in, that we forget that it's already right here in this skeletal tissue thing. We're not just spirit inside a body, we're body inside a spirit, and it's all connected. It's all right there, and that's where the divine is. And I love that you start out that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I read that story comes from a little book that I love called The Yamas and Niyamas by Deborah Adele. And it's really about the 10 yogic jewels, which starts with nonviolence and goes on and on. So I think where that story gets more and more beautiful for me is that if I can find God inside myself, I can also find God inside of every moment that I find myself in. And exactly, you said it so well. We want the ticket out of the hard situation or our own bodies, the things we don't like about our bodies. For example, I'm 49 now, and for the last 5 years, I've carried more weight than I ever have, like it just doesn't come off as easily. And I really struggle with that. So I have some body shame. And so, okay, I have to lose 20 pounds. And maybe I do, I don't know. Or that moment of, I hate how I look, that's actually where the divine is and where the divine can be found, like in that struggle. If I can learn to love myself, or maybe say it this way, learning to love myself in my body now is how I will find God,
I so love that you have just brought up body shame,
Well,
because
there it is.
I mean, that's the thing. Men and women go through it. I think it's more visually prominent for women, but men go through it just the same, right? The
Yep.
messages sometimes are more subtle, but I think the insecurity is just the same. And our body is the only evidence of our existence. We are soul, spirit. We are a conglomerate of relationships of energy and tissue and organs and all these things that we are. And the only thing that we have that's evidence of who we are is our body. I can't explain, say, a characteristic of, oh, that person's kind, or oh, that person's, because that's your actions and it's
Right.
expressed through your body, or oh, that person's really mean, because that's expressed through your body, it's expressed through your act. You know what I mean? The things that you are, for better and worse, are expressed through your body's actions, your facial expressions, your hand expressions, the weight you carry or don't carry. It's all there. So it's really important that we take care of our body, but the number one thing we attack, and I found this, I find the Western church was just as guilty of this, is attacking the body, what we could do with it, sexuality. I mean, obviously, Reverend Nadia Bowles-Weber has been key in trying to readjust the message, especially for women, about their bodies, because the body shame has been so terrifying, and it's something that so desperately needed to change.
Well, there's it's interesting. I can't remember who is writing about this, but there's this whole movement that's trying to understand the way that we're treating our bodies and what we eat and how we look as a kind of religion, with purging and like we feel terrible about ourselves if we eat this or don't eat that, and it's acting like it's turned into a kind of religion where we feel like we have to confess our sins, and where the perfect image, we see the perfect image, the perfect body, quote unquote, air quotes there. It's fascinating that it's become like worship,
Yeah.
and not in a good way.
Well, it's addressing the wrong issue, right? Like it's
Right.
not really addressing our relationships to our bodies, right? Which this goes to the LGBT conversation. This goes to the Me Too movement. This goes to exposing almost our own violence within and how we treat our own body. The shame that we put on ourselves for this attainable thing that we're supposed to be physically, sexually, our image based off, whatever the list is. What I theorize we actually just need to do is just simply say, what is my relationship to my body? Why do I feel that way? Where did that message come from?
Exactly. Like getting curious, like getting outside of that snow globe for a second. When I'm trapped in the snow globe, you know, all I can see is shame. All I can feel is rejection. All I can think, the only lens I can look through is shame, you know? So I think getting outside of it, I love that. What is my relationship with my body? Why do I think the way that I think? And what are the unconscious choices I'm making, but also inputs that I'm receiving that is reinforcing that viewpoint?
There's been significant messages that a person who adheres to a different type of attraction is, quote, bad. And it's come from a messaging that took an interpretation of a biblical time period thousands of years ago that had a different application within the
Right.
time that it was written. What has happened is there was a story that was taken to mean almost a literal thing when almost all the other laws around it were not taken as literally. Going back to sort of the Leviticus and Deuteronomy stories, and they were taken, and it was the body shame is the one that stuck out. Why do you think that is?
So the fascinating thing, in the first 5 centuries after Jesus lived and died, the big debate that the church had, and it went on for literally 500 years, was around the nature of the humanity of Christ. And so dualism says matter, bodies are evil, spirit is good. And so the idea of dualism really reigned for a long time. It's very Greek, but the incarnation, so from the Christian perspective, the incarnation is that Jesus is God who became a human being, so uniting spirit and matter, so if anything, Christianity should have been the religion that eradicated body shame, you know, that eradicated it. But again, for 500 years, people went back and forth. And finally, they actually decided that Jesus was fully both in some paradoxical, mysterious way. And that was a win. And it seems as though the church has never really been able to follow that true teaching. We Orthodox Christians say in the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, that they believe fully human, fully divine, but we don't treat our own bodies as if they're fully human, fully divine.
What do you hope people will take away? You go through the different areas of mindfulness, but what, if there's any key thing that you would hope someone would take away from this work, from this book?
Yeah, well, again, it's this idea that in some way, if you find yourself still searching for God despite the church and its foul theology, despite the many moments of disillusionment that you've had, despite the pain, if you still find yourself searching for God, then that sincerity of your search is enough, you know, and that you will find God exactly where you are in exactly the situation that you find yourself. And you don't need to escape. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to lose the 20 pounds. you you can breathe in and breathe out, and you will be found by God, and you can find God, and that journey will continue on and on and on for the rest of your life. I hope it feels freeing to people. I hope that feels easy, not in the sense of simple, but in the sense of we don't need to try so hard to find the divine. The divine really is deep within us, waiting for us with love. A book can't do that. But I hope that reading my words, something about my own sincerity and my own desire will somehow mystically, sacramentally find its way into people's hearts, souls, minds, bodies, so that they can find what they're looking for.
I hope part one provided something for you to chew on and take into your family conversations and your community conversations in the next couple of days, and that you'll come back for part two. I will put all of Steve's links, his book, his podcast, and the ways that you can follow him on Twitter, on Instagram, his work, his community. Until Thursday, may you live and move and have your being. Cheers.